Давайте покажу пультовую, на всякий случай, чтобы вы, если что, знали, мало ли что, я в другом конце зала. Потому что они видят только на экране все, что происходит, и слышат только то, что микрофон. Вот здесь пультовая, видео.
Уважаемые коллеги, я предлагаю начать работу нашей дискуссионной площадки, посвященной стратегии пространственного развития.
We need to start our discussions devoted to strategy of spatial development. And let me make a technical announcement. We do hope that our presenter from the Ministry of Economic Development, Deputy Minister Zhivulin, would be able to come on time. He keeps writing to me that he is at an important meeting, he's trying to get out of there, and he still promises to be here and to join us. That's why that's one person that we will be expecting to arrive later. Let's start our panel discussion devoted to spatial development strategy implementation mechanisms in the Russian Federation. My name is Vladimir Klimanov, head of the Institute of Reforming Public Finances and also chair of the Department of State Regulation of the Economics at Russian Academy of National Economy. We also have here with us Andrei Klepich, Deputy Chairperson of Vneshekonom Bank, Polina Viktorovna, Deputy Head of the Department for Economic Policies of the City of Moscow, Mikhail Dmitriev, Head of this Center for Economy and Infrastructure, and Pavel Kadachnikov, President of Strategic Development Center. I hope that we'll be able to involve the audience into the discussion due to the importance of the topic that we're discussing. As we heard in the morning from first Deputy Prime Minister and Mayor of Moscow, the topic of spatial development here in Russia is one of the truly important ones, and I totally agree that for Russia it's of huge importance. Like for no other country in the world, we are the largest country geographically. We have 1.5 times more land than China, the US or Canada, and manyfold bigger than many other countries. We have so many different territorial development division units, and that's part of the discussion of the spatial development issues. Do we need so many entities of the Russian Federation, so many units of management in one country? On average and individually, they are often lower than similar units in other countries, or smaller than in other countries. We are a country with huge geographic and natural differences between individual territories, from deserts to Arctic tundra, existing at different macro global levels facing Europe and Asia Pacific. And as we look at spatial development in a country like that, that is of particular importance. In light of that, the issues that were considered as this spatial development strategy was developed are of big importance, both for the federal center that needs to be able to manage such a big territory, and for every region individually that wants to see its place in reaching national objectives and strategic tasks that the government might have in general. It's also important for the government itself and for business that needs to adjust its activities to the peculiarities of a country with many time zones, with a fragmented national market, It's also important for many development institutions that are part of that process. It's important for the expert community that should issue corresponding recommendations and solutions to the problems of spatial development of our country. This is what we are going to discuss this afternoon. And in the beginning, we will give the floor to our presenters, and then we'll start another round of questions. But first, let me give the floor to Pavel Kadachnikov from the Strategic Development Center. In the last 2 years, they were generating various strategic documents globally. Moscow and St. Petersburg, can we give all residents of Russia the same availability and accessibility, or 2-4 hour accessibility that we have to get to Moscow and St. Petersburg? Of course not. Look at our territory. So all over Russia, we need to have global cities. If we look at what can we do until 2035, approximately 5 global cities would be enough, would be good enough. Immediately, the political dialogue starts. What kind of list we have there, who made it and who didn't. If we look at the situation now, Yekaterinburg, Kazan, Novosibirsk, whether it includes all the rest or what. And this is approximately how they are located on the map, an economic focus, how we want to see the future. If we have 5 global cities in the map of Russia, that would be modern economy that will be up to the goal or objectives that we have in the presidential decree. And finally, to understand our tasks and how they are connected to that, what's the city of today? We need an aviation hub with the passenger traffic of at least 20 million countries with their own airline. We see some airlines and hubs like that in Moscow and St. Petersburg, probably in Novosibirsk, but we also have Kazan and Yekaterinburg where it has to be done. It's a flow of international events, not just one event in 5 years, but every year some major international events, headquarters of global companies. 10 tourists per every resident of a global city, including 1/3 of those from foreign countries. And if we talk about that, or when we talk about global cities, the regions get offended. They say, oh, you forgot about us, and we shouldn't just develop 5 cities, and that's it. All regions should have this opportunity to have the social economic availability, getting all the benefits, and these cities should spread their energy to all surrounding regions. In this sense, Moscow should impact the central district. St. Petersburg has its own tasks, and all other global cities. These roughly are the ideas that we discussed when, together with Ministry of Economic Development, we discussed the strategy of spatial development. Other important things for Russia that are included into our strategy. Our raw materials, Russia will keep using its natural advantages, and those regions require certain development in terms of infrastructure and social issues. And of course, strategic territories, considering the size and location, we will have to deal with the Arctic, with the Far East. All that has to be covered as well. But economically, the main idea is around global cities that we should have all over Russia. Thank you. All right. In the beginning, you said that the strategy of social and economic development is in our Decree 204. And it's not easy to work on this spatial development project. Perhaps we don't need a strategy, but rather some other type of document that deals with those ideas that cannot be put into just one document. Maybe we need a separate document on how to make it into the global leaders in terms of cities, a separate document characterizing our infrastructural development. Is that possible or not, in your opinion? As we implement the presidential decree, we have this national project program. There's a list, there's this comprehensive plan for the development of the infrastructure. That's one of the most important components of spatial development, and all regions should see that. If you put yourself in the region's shoes, so to speak, that's not enough for them. Otherwise, Ministry of Finance will be the only tool of spatial development. I think it has to be a strategy. It has to have general guidelines of how we work with space in the long-term prospect, and then form the instruments of support for regions and cities and separate individual spheres where it's important as part of the national projects. In the absence of our federal officials, have I heard you correctly, the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Transport are the main carriers of this idea of spatial development in the country? That was a metaphor. Of course, regions understand very well. They all take trips, business trips. The most important ministry is the Ministry of Finance. This has changed in recent years. The Ministry of Finance makes important decisions. The same about Ministry of Transport, and there are some small amounts of money that they could collect from other ministries. But the biggest effect in terms of breakthroughs and investments would be from Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Transportation. Thank you. And let me ask a question to Polina Kryuchkova, representing here the Moscow Department for the Economic Policy and Development. We just heard how the current Russian leadership is based on the presence of Moscow and St. Petersburg, but we need more such cities. If we read the project of the spatial development strategy, it's all about developing a list of city agglomeration in the country, taking something away from Moscow.
Transferring headquarters of leading companies to other cities. If we look at other ideas related to the spatial development of Russia, they kind of put Moscow at a disadvantage. So what's the position of Moscow, and how does it see the strategy of Russia's spatial development as a whole? Well, I'd like to disagree from the get-go. I don't think that the spatial development of leading cities will somehow put Moscow to a disadvantage. Well, competition can be seen as a disadvantage for some monopolists, but if there is a monopoly, that leads to stagnation. So I believe that the development of Moscow, the development of the country shouldn't depend on only 2 or 3 growth drivers. There should be more than that. It is important that the project of the spatial development strategy mentions at least 20 cities, drivers of the economic growth. It's very good to have so many of them. What is a global city, and what's the role of Moscow in the country's economy? The most important thing is that Moscow indeed competes in the global sense of the word. It is the gateway to international markets. It is the city that hosts the headquarters of major international companies. This is a city that attracts 50% of foreign direct investment. It is a gateway to foreign export markets. It is a gravity point for human capital, for tourists, along with St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg and Moscow are the main such gravity points. And we have seen this during the World Cup in 2018. This is the biggest transport hub for aviation transport, which connects the entire country. Should we have more such points? Yes. Will this be bad for the interests of Moscow? Well, that depends on how we will build the spatial development policy and the economic policy, because one of the key choices that the federal and executive power has to make, they have to see how they can also take into account the interests of everybody when they want to support those regions that are lagging. So if we take the resources from large cities and put them to smaller cities, then it is not clear whether this approach would be good. So we need to stimulate the creation of large global cities, and they need to be clear that if they achieve a certain level of economic development, they need to be clear that nobody will take the benefits and those achievements away from them in favor of other cities. I believe this is an important thing as we discuss this strategy, as we develop the draft documents. Currently, the strategy exists by itself, national projects exist by themselves, but we don't have the right connection between them. There has to be the right logic, the logic that underlies the strategy of the spatial development of the country. Perhaps it needs to be fine-tuned, and it has to better reflect the logic of the national projects. That's my first thing. And the second important thing, when we speak about the spatial development, we should not only speak about the city itself, but the city agglomeration too. From the point of view of rank and file people don't care where to live, in the city or outside of it, because the administrative borders, they are pretty notional. And in fact, we should speak not only of Moscow as an administrative formation, but as the Moscow agglomeration. And if we look at any region, an agglomeration project is quite challenging in terms of management. There are a lot of municipalities whose interests have to be balanced and harmonized. In some cases, we're talking about several subjects of the federation and a lot of municipalities. So in fact, there is a very difficult task of forming mechanisms of managing agglomeration projects. How should these mechanisms look? Should it be purely project-based management? And then again, we have to answer the question whether our administrative division is sensible. This is an open question, but we have to think about it, because without adequate management structures, serious projects for the economic development of agglomerations will hardly take off. And the third idea that I would like to discuss is this. We are faced with the task of not only creating 25 centers of economic growth, we have the task of joining them together into an efficient infrastructure. There needs to be efficient transportation between these hubs. That way, we will multiply the positive effects of these hubs. Thank you. Thank you. Can I ask you an additional question? You, Sergei Sobyanin, said a very interesting thought, expressed a very interesting thought about the spatial development of city. He suggested giving financial independence to many regions. He specifically said that if Troitsk became a self-sustained formation, then it would never survive. So will strong regions or administrative formations benefit by including or subsuming other less successful areas? I don't think that I can give you a general answer that will fit all the cases, all specific cases, because each territory has its own unique advantages and disadvantages. For example, old Moscow used to have financial resources, Troitsk used to have the land, but didn't have enough financial resources to develop that land. That's the most basic example that I can give you right away. So I believe if we approach in a smart way the question of joining territorial units, if things are done right, then everybody will win. This is going to be a win-win situation, both economically and financially. If you have financially strong regions and you have regions that are not so successful in financial terms, if you have them work together, you may achieve the right synergy. But what's this configuration going to be? And here we have to ask the question, how sensible are the borders identified in the strategy of spatial development? That's a very serious question that has to be discussed. So now what are we going to have? We have some economically justified borders, or we are going to have purely administrative, technical divisions between these administrative formations. So again, there is a lot of room for efficiency, but there is no single one-size-fits-all solution. You said that Moscow is having a hard time, but still solving the problem of agglomeration development. In this regard, is Moscow ready to use somebody else's experience of agglomeration development? And do you think that Moscow's experience, Moscow and Moscow region's experience, can be replicated elsewhere? Let me start with the second part of your question. We have to be clear that due to the characteristics of the administrative territorial division of Moscow, Moscow is a federal level city, directly this experience can only be replicated in the St. Petersburg region and in St. Petersburg. In other places, hardly. Again, this is a whole range of challenging issues. Of course, some solutions have to be produced. Excuse me. With respect to the experience of other countries, of course, we study them carefully. We study carefully the experience of agglomeration management. The bottom line is there is no single solution, either financial or administrative. The world is very diverse. It would be a big mistake to try to find a one-size-fits-all solution, a standard solution, and to use it with every agglomeration in Russia. Now I'd like to ask Mikhail Dmitriev. We have heard twice now the idea that an efficient transport infrastructure is an essential element of any spatial development strategy. Transport infrastructure is a very expensive instrument. It requires a lot of investment from the budget. On the other hand, it requires the harmonization of interest between the Federation Center and the regions. Inter-regional connections need to be strengthened. I know that you have actively studied this problem, and you even suggested some ideas. You even performed some calculations related to the development of infrastructure in our country. Can you share some experience on that, please? Indeed, transport infrastructure, if we compare all the levers that the government can use to control economic growth through spatial development, then the contribution of transport will probably be around 70%. But even more than that, due to the fact that other levers are either smaller, weaker. For example, the development of the quality of the urban environment. It's an important factor, but less important in light of a lack of good transport and housing. Housing also plays an important role, but without transport, what good is it to have good housing if you don't have any transport? So, looking at plans, the contribution of transport over the next 8 to 10 years into the economic development will be larger than of other components of infrastructure, spatial development. There are a lot of projects that have not been implemented, that are languishing somewhere. I believe that their implementation should significantly expedite economic development. After all, we do have financial resources for that, for example, from the Development Fund. And now the projects that are being discussed now, I believe, have the right to be implemented, and I believe we can get a lot of economic benefits from that by jump-starting the spatial development process. The portfolio of these projects is estimated at about 6.5 trillion rubles. There are a lot of arguments about what level of funding will the Finance Ministry approve. Half of it will be federal funding in different industries of the economy. Private and budgetary co-funding can be in the range from 80 to 25%, 80% in port infrastructure, 25% for highways and vehicle roads. But overall, if we look at the contribution of this portfolio into the economic growth, I believe that over the next 8 years, this is about 10 trillion rubles of additional economic growth. But the thing is that this additional value discounted for inflation is accumulated exponentially, and the majority of these effects will only manifest themselves beyond 2020. The peak of these effects will be around 2025. And if we try to estimate the impact of the developed infrastructure on the economy, then we're talking about 35 to 40 trillion rubles. And that's about 40% of the current GDP. Usually, mostly this growth is realized through spatial channels. At this point, these are all nice words, but in some projects, including network projects such as the construction of high-speed rail tracks, BAM, Trans-Siberian, and others, these effects have been calculated. But the highway plan includes a lot of medium-sized projects, and we have to perform separate calculations for each of them and see how this combination of the entire portfolio of projects will impact the economy. There is no standard methodology for calculating the effects and the returns of those projects. We don't know how to factor in social variables, and To a certain extent, all of that is done as one wants, without clear understanding how the effects depend on the different combination of projects. So what projects have a larger weight or smaller weight, and these instruments don't even exist in the Ministry of Finance or Transport. The Ministry of Economic Development has featured on its website the methodology for the assessment of the impact of transport projects, but the most significant effects of transport projects have to do with the impact of non-movement of cargoes, and the agglomeration effects cover 30% of the entire cost of creating highway automobile road. That's half of the entire portfolio. Taking into account the corridor Europe, Russia, China. So, in essence, we don't know how fast this system will take shape, will be taking shape. We need more clear expert assessments, budget assessments. The burden of this work on assessing the impact and the of this plan will, of course, be done at the stage of the preparation of PPP projects. Most of these projects were implemented in the PPP framework. Based on my interactions with construction companies that participate in some of these projects, I can say that they don't see any chance of conducting any large-scale concession project without a clear calculation of social economic effects. And I believe that the Ministry of Finance will use exactly that information to calculate the amount of its funding. Currently, the Ministry of Finance is beginning to behave as an investor or an entrepreneur. Almost the entire volume of all the budget money will have to return as additional tax returns after the implementation of these projects, both directly and indirectly. So the whole work of calculating these effects will, of course, be done at the stage of preparing these public-private partnerships. We haven't yet identified what information support is needed, what expert support is needed. This is still to come. This will require a lot of work. This is going to be challenging. But the very idea that you can't accomplish any infrastructure project without first calculating how it will impact economic growth, this understanding has really settled in. Even major investors say that when they go to the subjects of the Federation, even to municipalities with proposals of specific infrastructure projects, the first question from the region's head or the department of municipality is usually how this will affect our economic growth and development.
We need to have something to show before we make decisions about any project. We need to have some evidence. So without understanding these external effects of infrastructural development, decisions cannot be made, and it's getting institutionalized, and it goes down to a fairly low level of decision-making at the territorial level. It means, in reality, that the next cycle of spatial policy will be drastically different from all previous cycles. In reality, authorities at all levels understood that the goal of spatial policy of today is to use it as leverage for speeding up the social economic development in general. And here the main measurements here are the growth of added value. Here I would argue that on top of growth of economic and social development of territories, we also have national security issues in mind, and many of those transportation projects are devoted to that topic as well. And also let me ask you one more thing. In light of this new stage that you were talking about and the spatial development of the country, do we need to revise some of the plans that existed earlier and based on some real financial opportunities that business and the country has? Recently, strategic planning documents contained everything, including whether you're ready to build a bridge from the Chukotka Peninsula to Alaska, where I was corrected here, it never made it into the documents, but there were some ambitious projects of building a second Trans-Siberian railway line going to remote territories there, but we see difficulties with bridge construction even in the city of Yakutsk. Should we revise some of those ambitious infrastructural development plans in our country or not? As we grow economically, these plans will be more and more ambitious. If we talk about the second tunnel, one in the Baikal-Amur railway line, one of the most controversial projects today. Currently, it costs a few hundred billion rubles, even more, but in 20 years, it will be about the same. But in 20 years, the gross domestic product in Russia will double if everything goes well. And the further you delay them, the more burden they are for the country. If we look at the specific list, there are very few assets or facilities that would not be profitable or useful. Baikal-Amur lines and Trans-Siberian railway line and the development of Far Eastern seaports, they are all of strategic importance, and they will give an incentive for the development of rural territories, which is also a priority for our leadership, and that will be healthy territories. And Trans-Siberian railway line and northern sea route, we are talking about hundreds of millions of tons of cargo. Most of the infrastructure is formed not under some kind of strategic impact or priorities. Almost all of them have economic effect, and they justify budget co-financing of all those programs. One more question to follow up on that topic. There are some alternative options for the infrastructural development of some specific lines. For example, there are a few options of how to build a railway line to the Barents Sea as one of the options. Many Siberian cities fight for attracting passengers to their airport to be used as a hub by connecting some transit traffic. How should the federal government participate in selecting these projects? Should they make a definite choice specified in a document and say all other options are postponed, or shall there be some other tool of selecting such an alternative option, which obviously exists in some cases? If we talk about hubs, it's not an issue of just the politics of a specific region, and sometimes it's beyond the jurisdiction of the head of that particular region. Of course, participation of federal authorities in those issues is unavoidable, precisely because the federal infrastructure is a federal property. As for reaching seas and oceans, these are trans-regional projects. For example, the railway infrastructure in Western Siberia The Banyankovo-Sabeta line in the north are viewed not just as tools to develop oil fields in that area, but also as a way to deliver grain from agricultural areas of southern Siberia. That's an interesting and innovative solution that will be carefully analyzed in terms of its potential and contribution into the development of territories. It's interregional. It's an interregional issue. Some of those projects will be moved up to the federal level. First, this particular road was had the status of a regional concession, and now, considering the importance of cross-regional effects, its status will be changed to a regional project with federal co-financing. In any case, here it's of huge importance, and I will dare say that none such projects of reaching seas will be able to avoid careful assessment of its contribution to the social economic development, not just for the region where this road is located, but for other territories which are going to be using this infrastructure. Thank you. Andrei, we mentioned some joint participation of government and business and structures around them in the development of the infrastructure. Yesterday there was a funny joke at the plenary session, if you noticed, when head of VTB said that banks were ready to implement infrastructure project. First Deputy Prime Minister said, excellent, we need to finance a few airports in the Far East. There was this sort of discussion during the plenary session. How do you see the role of development institutions in implementing the tasks of spatial development of our country? They spoke about this fund, infrastructure development fund, a new tool that's going to accumulate funds for that. The discussion is only starting, I think, and it will just gain momentum. It's not about discussions. That's what we had in abundance since childhood. We've had many different funds in the past. Some of us may remember the investment fund that's now dead, and that had once been established to finance infrastructural projects and then regional projects or interregional projects, because that would be any transportation project. Any transportation project has some interregional importance. Further on, we had this reserve fund, national welfare fund, and there was this big discussion how we need to use this money for some welfare projects. And now we are building another fund with the same goal. I hope we don't just set it up, but it will start actually working for the infrastructural development project and not just infrastructural ones. If we talk about development institutions, this national welfare fund is sort of an account managed by the government and Ministry of Finance, and it can go directly or indirectly. Some money went to Vneshekonom Bank. Vneshekonom Bank, as a development institution, also financed a broad range of transportation and other projects for the development of territory. Like in Sochi, it's not just a set of hotels, but it's building a brand new region, building a new type of resort and sports infrastructure. It's almost like building a new region from scratch. And this new look of the region was thanks to the Sochi Olympics and private business, and then those private businesses and projects ended up at Внешэкономbank Bank and the budget. So that's why it's important, not just in terms of what's being discussed right now as part of Ministry of Economic Development methodology. Not everything depends on the money. There's contribution of GDP and cross-regional effects. If we talk about development institutions, they have stricter requirements. The money should return even if in 20 or 25 years. That's why the role of development institution is twofold. And on the one hand, it's co-participating in some projects and co-financing when there are enough resources. But there's another set of questions, not directly about the development institutions, but because the development institution simply follows some of the instructions given by the government, and the level of freedom there is fairly limited. If we talk about spatial development, like we're discussing today, how it's reflected in the strategy project, spatial development is not just the development of cities or agglomerations. Or you can have this fun that there's no space in the spatial development. You have cities, but there's no space. You know, Lomonosov in the 17th century said that we should increase the reaches of Russia in Siberia, in the Arctic Ocean. But will it be happening? If we look at the reality, the specific importance or share of Siberia in terms of population and GDP of Russia is going down. This trend, will it continue? And those projects that we want to implement, will they change this picture, or our main center for the development will be Moscow and St. Petersburg agglomeration, 23–26% of GDP, and perhaps we will add Novosibirsk. Novosibirsk is growing, used to be a small city. Now it has 1.7 million residents, but Novosibirsk region around it is going down. Siberian Federal District from Norilsk to Tuva, to Mongolia and China, the share of that district is going down. And that's a serious problem, because the model of economic development that we have leads us to super concentration of population, money, and projects in a very limited set of agglomerations or bigger cities. If we look at the spatial distribution, what will we see? We develop sort of edges of the country, the Far East, Crimea, Caucasus, Kaliningrad. They might slow down in the future, but deeper into the continent, deeper into Russia, especially without Moscow, is going down. And this trend remain? And the projects that we have for the development of mainline infrastructure, by the way, they do have airports as well. There's this decision about 30 to 60 airports, and yes, most of the projects are in the Far East and other regions. But here's another question. An airport is a fairly expensive facility, and the runway belongs to the government, and the terminals are based on quasi-private funds, like at Sheremetyevo. Once, we used to have about 1,000 airfields and about 1,500 general aviation planes. People used to fly from Novosibirsk to Novokuznetsk in about an hour and a half. It takes about 8 hours by train. If you go from Novosibirsk to Kemerovo with traffic jams, it's from 8 to 9 hours. If you go at night, you can get there in 5 or 6 hours. In that sense, our distances are not reduced, they're greater. In the past, they had general aviation planes. There's the Sheregesh resort for skiing. Now, it's not easy to get there there's a commuter train, but from Novokuznetsk it takes about 2 or 3 hours. But in the past there was a flight, a 30-minute flight to get there. There are different models for the development of connectivity of our territory. In Yakutia, the bridge was estimated at 40 to 50 billion, but it's not that much. Crimean bridge is 10 times more expensive. It's a geopolitical decision and economic decision. We cannot implement all the projects, but it's obvious then there's this huge region, and they need to extend that railway over the Lena River or move the city, which was also actually considered, and billions of rubles or for other bridges elsewhere, and I hope they will build it, otherwise it won't work. This is a very complicated thing, not just assessing projects, but selecting between them, not just in terms of transportation. We have ports, we have airplanes. For example, we are building this MS-21 long-haul aircraft. We are going to finish it. It will take a while, and then we will build it. We want it to fly and to be operated. You can use that plane or Airbus, but it has its own spatial connection. It's built by Irkutsk, possibly Ulyanovsk in the future, and many other cities. And these are jobs. This is a life. Living not just in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the city of Irkutsk near Lake Baikal, but their quality of urban environment is much worse than in Novosibirsk. I hope those from Irkutsk will not get offended, but they don't want to leave their city. Irkutsk is a fairly big city. They have their own advantages. They have their own good things, not just because it's close to nature, to your roots, to the graves of your ancestors. It's how much time it takes you to get to your friend. It's a new, different social situation. It's not just about development institution. It's about the entire economic and social policy. People want to stay. I visited Archangelsk region. There are many dying villages there, but they don't want to leave those guys who try to find some work there, because the nature there is amazing. They were born there. Maybe those villages will die, but we want cities to live not just in 5 or 40 big cities, but all over Russia. What do we mean by 5 or 40 cities? That's very expensive environment. That's a lot of investments into roads and utilities. Yeah, it's simpler to get high quality education, but Cambridge and Oxford are not in London, and they live there, and many want to go there. Troitsk, which we recall there, it's not just about land. If you visited it, it's some of the largest nuclear research centers and physical studies, and people want to live there. They wanted to get the status of a science city or Akademgorodok. They don't want to go to Novosibirsk. There's a line, a queue of people wishing to live there because of the excellent conditions. Transportation is not easy, but from point of view of life, it's great, and they have a great university there.
It's better than in Novosibirsk with its traffic jams, with some questionable architecture. So when we speak about this city, the big question is the quality of urban infrastructure. Speaking about the institution of development, the new development, the new area of work for the Внешний Economic Bank is the foundation of monocities. We are trying to improve it in order to enable it to take development projects in those modern cities. If you look at American cities, the area the area of high risers occupied densely built and highly dense construction spaces, built spaces. They are populated by lower income people, and those who are richer, they live outside of the city and live in bungalows and two-story buildings. So I guess we have to think about it, and the Vneshekonombank has to think about this, take it as a personal challenge. So there are other things to think about, not only agglomerations, but of course we need agglomerations too. We are not part of the project announced by the Ministry of Economic Development, but this document reflects the idea that we need to think about the points of accelerated growth. I can say that Moscow is not the point of accelerated growth. It's a major innovative financial intellectual center, but its growth rate recently will be lagging the growth rate of Russia overall. That's on the question of whether or not Moscow is, whether or not it's a point of accelerated growth. Novosibirsk is, and Kazan is a point of accelerated growth. My question was this: should we identify such growth points and reflect them in relevant documents, or is this a natural situation that will simply reflect that at a certain historical period, certain territories were drivers of economic growth and they will relinquish its function and title to other places and cities? Well, you can say whatever you want in your documents. The most important thing is to make sure that it really reflects the reality. The question is, where are these centers and where they should be created? How do we stimulate their creation? As an example, Kuzbas. We remember the Severomulsky tunnel today. Has to do with the increase, with a significant increase of coal production. This is not only Tuva, Yakutia, and others, but Kuzbas was losing its population in 2000s, and it continues to lose its population. It has some growth rates, but now these growth points are decelerated growth rates. We have to think about how to increase the life expectancy there. We have a lot of regions where people live not so long. Maybe they live good lives, perhaps not so short, but I don't know. We need to really help those places become growth points, perhaps accelerated growth points. I hope that Yakutsk will also become an accelerated growth point. Did I get you right that we need to stimulate growth in driver regions? Yes, we need to stimulate, and we need to identify the places that are already growth points. We need to take stock of what we have now. We need to see what has to be stimulated, what doesn't have to be stimulated. Moscow is in a privileged position. Moscow is the financial center. St. Petersburg is another major center. But let's think about how do we use more oil proceeds, how do we leave more of oil proceeds and other revenues where they are generated. In other words, in the regions. Regions would receive more of their profits. If Nizhnevartovsk is growing, it's a very good thing. Urengoy is growing, but these are agency-specific growth. Urengoy is growing. There are very many projects. Some of them were started under the Soviet Union. Perhaps we should limit the growth. In other places, we should increase it. But we need to change the financial setup. Colleagues, do we need to somehow codify the points of accelerated growth, poles of growth, or other things that you think should be reflected in the spatial development document, spatial development strategy, in order to receive on a regular basis support from the federal center, from elsewhere? Colleagues. Mrs. Khrushkova. Well, currently, oil and gas constitutes only 4% in the revenue structure of Moscow because a major oil taxpayer, they sustain large losses. So the structure is a little bit different than what you have described. I agree that each region, municipality, and subject should have stable tax and non-tax sources of revenue. With respect to whether or not we should reflect the growth points in the strategy, the question is why? Why do this? We can have a lot of argument about what should be written in the strategy, whether we should have 40, 15, or 20 growth points. The question is why? What's the management benefit from that? If we call a place a growth point, what do we get in return? Or if we fail to call someone or someplace a growth point, that actually determines the answer to the question. If we fix a certain set of growth points, and would that mean that we need to take decisions related to funding, some regulatory changes, other management solutions? If we want to replicate something, this is not a strategy, this is just some research work about who grows, who doesn't grow. I believe that one of the problems of the current draft of the spatial strategy is that it has a lot of statements, but it's not clear what those statements are for. In order to rate the strategy of a macro region, it's quite useless to identify growth points. I believe that the answer to the question you asked really depends on what we want to achieve by doing that. Mikhail, what do you think about this? I believe that we are caught up in using cliches that have nothing to do with the real spatial policies. What do we need to understand about the future of spatial development? Primarily, the possibility of changing this rate of the territory's development due to some spatial development measures and the possible contribution of this, the overall growth rate of the Russian economy. In theory, we can do this. Moreover, our team conducted these calculations. We showed how the actions of certain federal and local authorities and regional authorities can impact the economic performances of the regions and even smaller formations such as municipalities, cities, towns, territories remote from the agglomerations but enjoying a high potential. We also need to understand the contribution of each territory in accelerating the development of Russia. The policy measures has to be weighed against the potential costs of a policy. If the policies in question are costly and the returns on those policies is limited, then we don't get any economy. There's no economics in those kinds of projects. In that case, the project would be mostly socially oriented. So I believe that would be a sensible approach. Also, we have problematic territories that will never become points of accelerated return. They will never increase their contribution into the accelerated growth of the Russian economy. They have their own problems. Of course, they will have to continue spending money on addressing those problems. Of course, the federal center will have to pay for it, in part the region. Very often, social spending is sometimes completely out of whack with what you get out of that spending. So I guess there should be a very balanced approach that takes into account the potential outcomes, the potential benefits of any spending, including social. But these cliches about growth points and the attempts to assign a certain specialization to those territories, it has little to do with the tasks and goals of the spatial development strategy. Pavel, I'd like to support the colleagues, but if we look at the history of region's development, we have really decreased recently the social differences between the regions. They are still high, but they have become smaller. But economically, there are still huge differences. The economic situation in the country is very uneven. Of course, we can consider different sectors of the economy. Infrastructurally, taking into account the deficit of infrastructure, it is clear what should be built where. It is clear where we have growth points, but when we begin to assign growth points, we destroy everything immediately. Some growth points will be growing faster, others will stop growing. Federal politicians stop paying attention to them. Even people who work in those regions, they stop feeling that they are needed. The federation should have some priorities, and these priorities should be funded. And then the regions should think about their role. If I build technoparks, that's one story. If I develop tourism, that's a different story. Give them an opportunity to do something on their own initiative. there is a lot of room for initiative. I'd like to give the floor. I'd like to give the microphone and the opportunity to ask questions from the audience. We have a lot of people from the regions here. Please identify yourself and speak into the microphone, please. Khanty-Mansiyski district, first deputy of the governor. I listened to the colleagues. Some of the things I liked, some of the things I didn't. The Khanty-Mansiyski autonomous district that provides half of the currency revenues, foreign currency revenues, was not part of the growth strategy. No growth points or anything. There were some limited regions that received funding, and there was no donor regions. We have worked with Vladimir Zhivulin, and after that some growth points appeared. Pavel said it right. As soon, well, if we weren't mentioned, then we wouldn't be able to expect anything. So it's a very serious issue. The backbone, the economic backbone of the country should be reflected in this spatial development strategy. The second issue that I would like to highlight is the question about macro regions that everybody is very doubtful about. When I asked the designers, how did you create those macro regions? We looked at the federal districts and we decided to join them. Colleagues, there is the statement of state standard, and it lists all the economic macro regions, associations, so on. For example, we were joined into the West Siberian, including Yamal, Khanty-Mansiysk, but the Western Siberian region includes nine sub-regions, so we have infrastructure development agreements with some regions. For example, with the Tomsk region, with the Sverdlovsk region, we exchange benefits. So macro regions are a very important issue. So, of course, a lot of work has been done. This strategy, nevertheless, has to be improved. If we look at the economic benefits, we have to consider things that are directly related to the economy, not something that was created purely administratively or for other purposes, such as the military command and control. Another question here. Please identify yourself, what region you are from. Maxim Vakushenko, the Minister of Economic Development of the Rostov region. There are stories of success and failure. We actually like the draft of the strategy. In fact, we're one of the leaders. So on the wave of this success, we even passed a law in the first region about agglomeration development in the Rostov region. And I have a lot of respect for Andrei Nikolaevich. I studied his publications. So what's first? For example, we have the city of Volgodonsk. It's an interesting case for the development and strategizing. Volgodonsk was established in 1950. It was just a place on one of the channels there, and in 20 years the population of the city grew to 100,000 people. That's just an example. That's just food for thought, especially when we discuss the spatial development strategy about how the cities can be established, how they can be developed. I visit the cities and localities of my region. The question is, Why do people not leave? Or why do they leave?
I talked to entrepreneurs, scientists, intelligentsia. We have another city of Taganrog, 260, 270,000 people, 60 kilometers from Rostov, and people never leave this city. It's a city of high culture, of intellectuals. There are some affluent people there. Just add a better road, maybe move the seaport, make some recreation, and that would be a success because it's near the border with Ukraine. And the road M4, how everything is better around these transportation corridors which go through a Rostov region. Let's see if we have any more questions. Good afternoon. First Deputy Chairperson of the government of Penza region. On the one hand, I'd like to support my colleague. What's primary, infrastructure or development? There's this foundation for the development of mono cities, and there was this proposal that currently you have to be very careful to justify that the infrastructure that is going to be built will be in demand for a specific project that will be used for the territory. Business treats it in a very different way. If some time ago Federal Reserve Fund hadn't financed some utilities in the Penza region, currently, when in one of the mono cities we got some major investors, they came only because it already had infrastructure that they needed. Had they not had this infrastructure, we wouldn't be able to develop the city of Sverdlovsk in our region. So if we as a region are willing to take responsibility, if there is financing from the Fund of Developing Mono Cities and other institutions, if we say we are going to be responsible, that infrastructure is going to be in demand. If we fail to do it in the future, that would be the responsibility of the region that will have to compensate the expenses of the foundation of federal budget for the construction of this infrastructure. And my second point, since we have colleagues from the Ministry of Economic Development, here's my question. Now we analyze carefully and we gave our proposals to the strategy of spatial development. Some of our proposals have been taken into consideration, but how can regions be united? There are many questions. With all due respect, from Bashkortostan, it's more than 1,000 kilometers from Penza to Bashkortostan. We have regions that are much closer to us, and when we decided to, when we started to discuss it with experts, they say we respect the economic potential of Bashkortostan. We have no serious economic connections with them. We're always moving towards the central region. We would really like you to consider this proposal as well. We are going to send it to you. Please consider it as well. And also, what about the fact that in some cases infrastructure should be ahead of projects? Thank you. I totally agree with you. Many infrastructural projects, not just in terms of mono cities and in principle, this is the foundation for future projects. For example, that tunnel that we discussed is more for the future. And now Vadim Zhivulin, Deputy Minister of Economic Development of the Russian Federation, just joined us. I would give him the floor. I would just briefly tell you how the discussion went. We decided not to discuss the text of the strategy of spatial development, but as soon as I gave the audience the floor, they immediately began to look at that text that was presented by the Ministry of Economic Development some time ago. We spoke about spatial development objectives. We said that we need more than 2 global cities in Russia, and then we discussed agglomeration issues, which are of importance. Here, Moscow shared their experience about how it's done in Moscow and Moscow region. And another good idea was that you shouldn't infringe on the interests of other regions, but not killing leading regions. Then we moved on to the development of the infrastructure as something connecting our territories in the country, spoke about efficiency of certain projects of infrastructural development, and then how to add financing here for different stakeholders and development institutions. Should we transform anything within this new cycle? And then provocatively I began to ask whether we need to assign points of growth or they are natural and we shouldn't be paying attention to them. We had a discussion, and now you will have to tell us about what's going to happen. Thank you. I apologize sincerely to all of you for my skipping almost the entire session. This is something I could not avoid. I really wanted to be here from the very beginning and hear the discussion and tell you about our strategy. I will try to be brief now. The strategy, the way it has been prepared now, is a very complicated document which is not even final yet, and we continue working it. Why I call it complicated, very complicated. In the last several years, spatial development and tasks for the regions, how they can cooperate and interact and look for different development institutions for different type of territories. This issue had always existed, but there was no attempt to give a comprehensive answer to it. The spatial development strategy is not a document for interregional interaction only or interbudgetary relations. This is a document that requires spatial organization of the economy as viewed by the Russian Federation entities. Different Russian Federation entities in this strategy define different roles and their space in that system. Why does it happen? Due to objective reasons. All entities, they are equal in the constitution and status and their importance in the political life and so on. In reality, there's a disbalance that we wanted to remove. Why do they keep talking about 20 major agglomerations that are going to develop and forgetting all others? That's a big question for me, perhaps because the audience, the readers, users, experts, they may look at one of the first versions where we focused more on big city agglomerations. As we continued working on that text and working with experts and specialists, we realized that for every type of territory, we need to define their functional role and task. Thus, we got not only major agglomerations, thus we got all those agglomerations. If we look at Presidential Decree 204, it talks about the largest agglomerations. Also, there were territories of geostrategic importance. Those entities of the Russian Federation that are not stable growth points, such entities still have prospects of growth, and they were assigned to that particular category. there also are different levels, the federal one, the regional one, and primarily the task of the document is not to set aside some specific type of territory and then say that in the future we'll be investing our entire resources into those, but to try to select a unique and important set of solutions for every territory. What kind of solutions are those? They can be of very different type, different infrastructural projects. Infrastructure was mentioned in that presidential decree, and to form it, we also are preparing a special comprehensive plan for the development of infrastructure that should help Russian Federation entities to remove some of those bottlenecks, to interact more actively. It's a special set of solutions that should help big and largest city agglomerations to develop those agglomeration ties that are being formed around major capitals and cities. And it's a set of solutions that should be addressed to smaller and medium-sized cities. The document also mentions their special status. In Sochi, in spring this year, at the investment forum, we spoke about the fact that such small and medium-sized cities should also see their role and place in this document. May I interrupt you for just a second? We're almost out of time. I want to focus on two specific issues here. First of all, why do we need those macro regions? What do we mean by efficient specialization, or something that was misinterpreted about their region? You spoke about infrastructure a lot, and you didn't get any answers. Yes, that's to the point. Let me start with specialization. Specialization is needed so that the competitive advantage of a certain region could be made more pronounced, more obvious, and you can simply relate all codes of economic activity to all regions of the Russian Federation and say they're all equal in that sense, but that's not true objectively. And by current economic specializations, we define those specific areas where those entities are developing more dynamically, but for each one of them, we talk about promising economic specializations, something that's being actively deployed, or something where there's no active work, but due to spatial factors, geographic factors, or peculiarities of how higher education is organized, they say that some of that can be problematic. The discussion is not over yet, but I can assure you that with every Russian Federation entity, with every region at the level of the deputy governor, we had some expert work done. Those industries that were misclassified, we did that work as well. There was this issue about certain types of economic activity. Some of them were funny. This is how our codes are designed. We made it, looked at it until the second digit. That's how it's shown in the specialization. Why do we need them? To give incentives to those efficient areas that are objective growth drivers in every region, and those that are not in use enough, that's a reason to pay attention of the investors and authorities, and those support measures that could be used as a priority for certain types of activities that are neglected by the Federal Center for a number of reasons. If you look carefully into that text, this strategy is a descriptive document. It describes how the country should or could develop by a certain period. There's something that is justifying the economic specialization is something that we can use in a variety of ways. And depending on how these specializations are limitations, we already said they are no strict framework that one should stick to. These are just overall guidelines. But what about macro regions? Here's the situation with macro regions. We have to define them in the strategy because they were in the decree that defines the basics of regional policy at 2025, and there we had to define those macro regions that we had to have. And okay, we proceeded from the fact that it's not some kind of redistribution or making them smaller or anything like that of those entities that are so closely connected to one another. We are talking about a consolidation of efforts and joint work between regions that are neighboring. Why would we need them? To prepare strategies for the development of Russian Federation entities, to think about and to build joint infrastructure that could strengthen economic ties. The macro regions are needed for some kind of additional work or stimulus for interregional interaction and cooperation, and is not connected with defining the new political map of the country and so on, something that experts mentioned many times, like rewriting the constitution and so on. Today, during the plenary session, there was another thought expressed by First Deputy Prime Minister. He said it's all about economics, not policy. Politics, maybe 2 or 3 brief questions from the audience to any speakers, and then we'll have to wrap up. Are there any questions left? Here's one. Please introduce yourself. My name is Konstantin. I'm an employee of the Ministry of Finance. I'd like to thank all the experts for all these presentations, and let me ask a question to Vadim Alexandrovich. In your opinion, how do we define that? How will it impact the system of interbudgetary relations? That's an excellent question. Thank you. The strategy itself is based on a broad set of measures that are mentioned there. Within 6 months after confirmation, an implementation plan for the strategy should be prepared, including specific solutions that should define how it's implemented. One of the items of the future implementation plan is this clause. We are very careful about it now, about changing the approach to cross-budgetary affairs. We are very careful about it. This is a controversial issue with a huge amount of questions to this topic. We would like this specialization to be considered, but how to do it, that's a matter for a separate and very detailed expert discussion. All right, colleagues, any more questions? All right, let me sum up here a little bit and say that the spatial development remains to be an important problem for the country. Looking back a couple of decades ago, in our country there were many attempts to set up a document regulating the development of regions. You may not remember that in 1994 there was an excellent strategy for the regional development of Russia prepared at the presidential office. And when they were trying to understand what Russian Federation can be in this new federative situation outside of the USSR, it did not work. Then there was this decree 803 in 1996. At the late of the 90s, there was this Ministry of the Regional Policy, which we are forgetting. Then it was restored as the Ministry of Regional Development. There were many different concepts that had to reflect how the federation should work with regions, how regions should be developing. Gradually, it changed from the regional development to the spatial development, giving focus on the development of Russian Federation entities and territorial planning and development. There was this topic related to cities, which used to be neglected in the past. And I wish that the strategy of spatial development that we are now generating by the Ministry of Economic Development and is being publicly discussed to be accepted and serve as the tool of reaching those goals and strategic development tasks that have been mentioned in other documents, including Decree 204.
And I think then we will achieve something new, something better, larger, and I wish all of that to everybody.